Good evening. You're listening live to the Extreme Movie Show. I'm your host, Rob. Tonight, we're going to be covering 1987's Robocop, a very violent, a very funny, a very typical extreme type movie that you would get out of the 1980s, full of just tremendous amounts of gore, brutality, and police violence. Overall, a much better change up than some of the lighthearted fare like in E.T. or the Goonies. And so I want to talk a little bit about this movie and how popular it got to be and some of the people involved in it and some of the key things about it that's changed where you wouldn't necessarily see that in a lot of films today. So when RoboCop came out in 1987, it's something that had been around for a while, and getting people who would actually direct it, star in it, and all that was a bit of an issue. But finally, it did get made, and Peter Weller, who ends up being the guy in RoboCop who gets whacked beyond belief and comes back resurrected by a company to be a cop, stars in it. And those of you that are really into Jeff Goldblum and all that would remember him from the Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai from I think 84 or 85. But Peter Weller is somebody that's known for that as well. And also, Peter Weller, he'd be a perfect candidate for the Extreme Movie Show's Chin of the Week. Yeah, something we used to goof around with early on about actors and their strong jaws, whether they're male or female. But RoboCop is a movie that if you watch it, you would be surprised at the tremendous amount of violence in it, even though it's kind of like an over-the-top violence to get its point across. It doesn't just give you like a big splashy Toxic Avenger-ish type of violence. It gives you violence that you're like, okay, I get it. But then they pile on and pile on and pile on. And so much so that a lot of this movie, whatever themes you think are being messaged to you about this film, sometimes it gets lost in it because of the gore of it. And while it's kind of funny at first, after a while, you're like, oh my God, they just didn't do it for one or two scenes. They did it for the whole movie. A movie that the director Paul Verhoeven ended up doing, of course, was Total Recall a few years later with Arnold Schwarzenegger. And if you see both movies, you can definitely see the comparison between them as far as the makeup and some of the extreme effects that are involved in it too. And of course, Arnold Schwarzenegger was just on fire in the 80s going into the 90s. And it seemed like a movie like this RoboCop film, even though it had some sequels later on and all that in a reboot about 10 years ago, let's say 2014. It was one that actually kind of did well by word of mouth. It was a minor hit, but I think just because of its brutality in the face of all the sugar-coated goodness like the Goonies that which we recently reviewed here on Extreme Movie Show, it was a hard movie for some people to kind of change their mindset and go take. And unfortunately, I think people are missing out because my initial impressions are this: it's a hell of a lot of fun. It's extremely over the top. It's a great thrill ride too, and it's a step above other cop revenge type films, and we're going to get right into it here for a little bit. So I'd like to say hi to Ed and everybody else here popping up here in chat. For me, I think the one thing I want to talk about first is some of the people that are involved in it. For me, when we talk about this movie and we talk about some of the people in it, you have a young Miguel Ferrer who ends up being on Twin Peaks a couple years later, and he was just a nice character actor at the time that could deliver very sarcastic, deadpan kind of delivery with a hint of just being a complete dick to it. So he's in here. Ray Wise, who would also be in Twin Peaks a little bit too, as Lord Palmer's father, has got a slight role in here, shall we say. And of course, to me, this is before Paul Verhoeven really blew up. So this movie, I think, cemented the fact that he would later on go and be involved in bigger movies, as it were. So I don't know. To me, some people who look back on this want to talk about police being military and being run and anti Ronald Reagan, who was the president at the time, who at this point had the biggest sweep in getting reelected a second time in the 80s. So there's a lot of patriotism involved. But Iran Contra, as far as the scandal, caught up to him a little bit. So it started to decline here in the late 80s, too, before things started to change. But I don't see this as a really totalitarian type film. It's a revenge film. And if you just leave it at that, you can see everything that works. And let's talk about revenge. Detroit, American iconic city, at least it used to be, until unions took over too much. It went bankrupt, I think, at one point, or it got extremely poor. And by the 80s, it was just a shell of its former self. People were moving out. And even though you might have been a Chicago Bulls and Detroit Pistons fan in the 80s, basketball wise, The Detroit Pistons moved to a swanky place, Palace of Auburn Hills, outside of Detroit. So even sports teams were trying to get away from downtown Detroit. And also, another thing too is when we think of Action Jackson, which would be a film about Detroit later on with Carl Weathers in it a year later, which is also an over top kind of blaxploitation 80s type film with the 70s vibe. This movie shows Detroit and how ugly it is. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people ignored the fact that in the 80s, we had a lot of big cities with a lot of issues. And so it seemed like there was two types of people. There were the haves and there were the have-nots. And the middle class, as much as we were trying to ignore everything going around negative in the world around us by enjoying things like the Goonies and going to our malls and everything else there too. This is a movie that definitely puts it on display. And what's cool about Robocop as a vengeful cop, there's so many different bad people for him to get his revenge on the corporation as he tries to solve a murder here. He's got your street level thugs, your goons, your generic people you'd see out there. You've got your inner city kind of, second tier type ones, all the way going up what we like to call here on the Extreme Movie Show the boss food chain until you get up to the big wig, numero uno, the head cheese, El Guapo, El Capitan, whoever that person is, you're going to get. There's a scene in here that I think just totally depicts what this movie's all about. There's a scene where they're talking about a robot, and there's nothing says 80s like we're going to physically be away from the scum on the streets by being in a high rise with a great view, and we're going to be a room full of people with wearing lots of really nice suits and ties, and we're all going to be discussing things like we're evil corporatists. And there's a scene in there where this robot I was just sitting there, and the one guy says to the other guy, "Hey, I want you to take this gun, and I want you to point it in a threatening manner." So this guy takes the gun, and he points at the guy who gave it to him, and he goes, "No, not me, at the robot." So he turns around and he points it out to him, and then all of a sudden you get this robotic voice saying, "You have 20 seconds to comply. Remove the weapon, blah, blah, blah," something along those lines. And so you get this countdown, and you've got this big room full of people and this one guy with the gun. And at first, with the stupid countdown, we know it's coming. He's kind of like, yeah, whatever. And then when it seems to escalate around the 10 to 5 second mark, and then all of a sudden, when it gets to zero, he's like, authorization to eliminate. And then boom, the guy gets lit up while everybody's going ape shit in here. And not only does he get shot and shot and shot, he gets shot some more, and he's just laying out there with probably 100 blood packs exploded all over his body from practical effects. And then the guy who had the gun says, in a real serious dickhead kind of way, um, that's can somebody call an ambulance when obviously there's no need for it. So there's some of this kind of really bad humor, dry humor in it, but it's done with a real serious, dark tone that you go, oh my god. And I like it in here with this movie because it's brutal, it's nasty, but it's a lot of fun. And I got to give a lot of people credit on here because this isn't what I would call a blockbuster type film where it hinges on great acting. This is the type of movie where everybody can contribute to it, not just Peter Weller, but the director, but all the side characters and all that too. I think it's something that's absolutely just incredible. Hey, Johnny, how's it going? The PS5 Robocop game looks amazing. I don't think that I've seen a trailer or anything for it yet. I might have to take a look at it. I know that unfortunately, I think for a lot of people, just because it's a franchise and has staying power, when they tried to reboot it a while ago, it was like, what? What the hell is this? It's just not quite the same. And even though Carl Urban did that one movie a few years back in the building, whose name escapes me right now, it kind of reminded me of RoboCop a little bit, but whatever. I think that was Judge Dredd, right? Remake or reboot or whatever you want to call it. And it was okay, but there's something about RoboCop and the way it captures some of these things. The blight of the city, the haves and have-nots. You see that in some other '80s films that are a bit darker and cynical, and therefore, by extension, not as popular as these syrupy films like the Goonies. Because God forbid, you go to a movie to have fun and they get serious on you with violence or something else. You see a lot of these '80s things too. Like I say, guys in suits, high rises. Just a terrible city with lots of crime going on in a major city, revenge and cops. Let's talk about cops for a minute because I think this is important. Cops, basically in the '70s, at least up to a point when a lot of TV shows and movies were considered really competent, sometimes, almost militant in their way. And you can go back to, you know, Starsky and Hutch. You can go back to even on a juvenile type of note, the Hardy Boys was refreshing and fun, but they were smart, good-looking guys that knew how to get things done. And even though that was a, juvenile type show, you always thought detectives were kind of cool. And so by the late 70s, early 80s, you had this branching off into two directions. You had your shows like your Remington Steele. You had your shows like TJ Hooker or like say Hunter. You had a lot of cop shows, but unfortunately, a big part of cops being shown on television and whether it's TV movies or TV shows or movies in general was we're going to make cops these fat donut eating imbecilic buffoons, for lack of a better term. You don't see them as being like Dirty Harry was 10, 20 years ago back in the 70s going into the 80s. So it's really interesting that you had these really distinct two different points of view of cops and how they would exert street justice or protect and serve or whatever you want to call it. Because you think back to Chips. Did you really take that show seriously? No. But did you have fun with it? Yes. But in the 80s, you had all these things, Simon and Simon. I mean, God forbid, you were big on Magnum PI. There's a lot of them. It seemed like the sexy, cool way the path went into the detective area. You had, gosh, Murder She Wrote was extremely popular for a long time, but cop shows and cops got sillier and stupider for quite some time. And I don't know that that's ever really recovered, unless you count something like a one-off, like a True Detective or something. But for the 80s to be captured like this, and throwing a little bit of a military, I wouldn't even call it science fiction type situation here, although some might look at it that way, with him being the RoboCop, it was kind of cool at the time. And one of the things that Peter Wellerth is so good in here is just his movement, the way he's able to physically carry himself around. He sells what it's like to be robotic. And I don't mean the way he delivers his lines or whatever, but just it's a simple looking suit. It's nothing predatorish or out of this world. It doesn't distract you from what's going on as this. He's supposed to be kind of an automaton, but then things happen. He starts to recall things, and the revenge part just goes from there more and more. But it's a step above, like, say, your canon films that might have revenge films or ninjas in it and other things, because, like I say, it's got a lot of different levels that he has to work his way up. So there's plenty of opportunities for violence. And so you're not going to miss out on any, I think, big reveals or secrets or swerves or, oh gosh, they introduced this in the second or third act. So therefore, I'm going to change my opinion on how the film's going. No, it is pretty straightforward. And that's, again, it can be that way. And we kind of understand where he's coming from, and whether you sympathize with him or not, maybe the violence might turn a younger viewer off. But back then, you're like, hell yeah, get your damn revenge, bro. You're in his pocket, and you're looking at it like it from that point of view, rather than, oh, he's just a cop, but now he's like a Superman kind of cop and all that. I don't think that's the way most people take a look at it at all. Um, Johnny in chat's talking about how Judge Dredd with Carbon was really good. You know, Johnny, there had been talk for a while about remaking some John Carpenter films because he's getting older and getting ready to die at some point. He's in his mid 70s and he doesn't do anything now except music, and he tours a little bit, plays his themes, which is cool. You can see a lot of that on YouTube, and he's got some albums out, Lost Themes 1, 2, and I think 3. He scored some recent Halloween movies. But when you talk about John Carpenter and his scores and you talk about characters, you think of Snake Plissken. And so there was talk about trying to reboot it at some point. So maybe Carl Urban would be somebody that you could go, yeah, he does remind me of that. It wasn't until we saw The Walking Dead and we saw, was it John Barenthal doing some of these roles, like The Punisher, where you go, hey, maybe he's somebody else who could pull that off. But even though a movie like this has some violence in it and can be a bit off-putting to some people, there is still kind of an 80s coolness, cheesy camp factor to it, but it's hard to blend those two. Um, the camp factor in Action Jackson, for example, that comes out after this is very apparent, and you don't mind that, even though it was Carl Weathers' opportunity to get away from the Rocky franchise and do something on his own. It's highly entertaining, but it's not nearly as dark as this, despite the fact it is extremely violent. But it does have a good 80s, boss vibe camp feel to it here, like this movie has. But this has that kind of darker side to it, kind of like a Dark Minute that would be out in a few more years too. Um, Yeah, sequels for They Live, to kinda turn the tables here a little bit. If you hear John Carpenter talk about some of these movies in the '80s, he'll always lament the fact that there was a lot of these cutesy films or whatever, and that some of his movies suffered, and he felt that was just, they were good films, but a lot of people at the time didn't necessarily appreciate them because they wanted the simple, easy stuff to watch. And there's a point to be made here besides bitter old man syndrome, and because I'm a big mark for John Carpenter films, but he himself will sit there and say that movies like They Live were like my solution to capitalism and the problems supposedly it causes. It's an anti-Ronald Reagan type film, and frankly, I just would argue the opposite here too. But there's definitely this idea of making cops look stupid, then the militant version of them, like you get here, that I think kind of continues to this day. And without bringing any modern situations up, I will simply sit there and say I think the trend is true that back then in the '80s, you talk about technology, what can it do for you? Everybody was exploring technology, especially from Japan. But this is before Japan blew up their economy by printing a lot of money. They were the ones that supposed they were going to overtake anything. And the people that thought China would do that, the very few people, well, now it's what's going on over there. So these themes, I think, are pretty valid to kind of put up, but they're not the reason why you're having the film. You're not trying to have a message. And while They Live is very cynical at the end, and I absolutely love that film, I think it's great. Um, it's a little bit different, I think, than RoboCop. One, it's not particularly violent; it's a bit slower, whereas RoboCop's just a blast. This is one of the I would call super popular midnight movies to go see. Do you want to go see this on a Saturday afternoon? Sure, maybe. But if this is one of those movies you want to see 8, 10 o'clock on a Friday night with your friends and all that, different kind of crowd at that time, absolutely perfect. And so unfortunately today, I think with movies, you don't get a lot of them that you get this build up for to go see other than say Top Gun by word of mouth. But you also didn't get don't get the idea that these B-level type films like a RoboCop surely was, even though it's a very good film, that that's the kind of movie you want to see later at night, or some theaters due to how many screens that it would be let out on, or maybe even the rating with it. Some chains may have chosen to say, I'm going to have more PG films playing for more money. Some might say, no, we cater to this kind of crowd, so we're going to do these midnight type movies, definitely. And now with everything streaming online and everything that's going on with consolidation, that's going to happen, in my opinion, here within the next year or so. I think you'll see some combining of some of these big streaming giants and some of the content kings out there. You just don't have a situation like it. So when RoboCop 2014 came out, I went, "What? They did it? Didn't even know anything about it." And while it might look great because you can digitize stuff and all that, there's still something to be said for practical effects, and RoboCop has them. And it's hard because if you have something that looks kind of plain like a suit, if it looks too campy or too childish or too goofy, it can really lower the level of film because it has to be passable and realistic enough where I think thanks to Peter Waller's movements in here, um, it pulls it off. You can sort of say it did its job, you know. Um, yeah, the Black Phone Johnny is something we've been talking about. It's not been seen yet, but it's on the short list. Definitely, I know that's been mentioned, and you brought it up before. Um, again, with RoboCop or even something like the Black Phone, you go, "Oh, that's kind of an interesting trailer," or "I like the way something looks." And visually, film is a visual medium, so it doesn't have to be scored great. It doesn't have to have great acting necessarily. It's about pictures and stuff. And so again, kind of going back to what RoboCop's all about, it's a revenge film. It's violent. It's a bit dark. I don't know, and I'll simply say is I don't know if I would call it a happy ending. It might be a fitting ending, just like you might say that about They Live. I'll leave that for you guys watching it to decide. But yeah, you've got to check this film out if you haven't seen it. This is definitely a scene that or a movie that if you see it, you're familiar with some of the scenes, you're like, oh yeah, I forgot what a load of fun that movie is. This thing is really, really good. But yeah, definitely check this out here too. Any other final thoughts I have about it would be this. Um, it's neat when you go back and you look at a movie and you can see other actors and you go, oh, these guys were in Twin Peaks, like I mentioned. So when we reviewed Twin Peaks here on the Extreme Movie Show on our Extreme TV version, it was nice to say, hey, I've noticed this guy. He did this. He did that. Um, you start to realize when you go back and you review some of these 80 films that, well, wait a minute, before this person was big or famous, they played a supporting role in the film here. And you get to realize that, and this is one of my co-hosts, or co-guests, very, very well said point, is that you start realizing that the 80s had a lot of strong character actors, or the people that would pop up in this film or that film. You'll see that in Steven Seagal films of the 80s, which were reviewed, about certain people, or you see it as the bad guy or a bad guy or one of the street thugs, because they work well with whoever they're working with there. So it's like a crew gets together on the next film and does it. Nothing wrong with that. But here you've got a lot of solid acting where there's a party that might go, oh, these guys are schlubs. They haven't done anything. They haven't been around. But when you start pulling up some of the names of these guys and gals and seeing what they've been involved in, you're like, no, they knew that their job wasn't to come in and overshadow it. It was anything. It was to elevate the whole Robocop thing too. So it's like knowing your role on the sports team. Your job's to set somebody up, whether it's to, in basketball terms, set a screen or pass the ball or take the shot. It's all about that too. And frankly, it's feed the big guy, and that's exactly what they do here in Robocop. They feed Peter Weller, and he delivers. So, really excited having rewatched it. I have not seen it in a long, long time, and I thought, God, I forgot how much fun this movie was. But again, a part of me went, God, I forgot how violent it is. A part of me went, yeah, I'd love to see another movie like this that can get a little bit violent, but not stupid violent. Although you might argue, if you haven't seen a lot of violent films, that this is too. But you know, is it on the level of Toxic Avenger in terms of gore and guts? I would say in terms of volume, sure, but it's a different kind of violence, and it's definitely a theme to it, because it takes it to another level, and that's what makes it extreme. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to review that here on the Extreme Movie Show. So, guys, check it out. Um, be on the lookout for something else here coming up next week. When Sunday comes around, three of us will be probably picking out another 80s movies on the short list. We have some films like Kroll. We've got some Animals Attack movies we've been talking about, because it's July and that's getting to be Shark Week. It's getting to be talking about it. We just talked about a Tarantula movie starring William Shatner. Um, it's called Kingdom of Spiders, by the way. If you haven't checked it out, that's a good one. Mostly real spiders. So yeah, guys, have a good night. We'll talk with y'all later. We'll look at something to get put up there, and then next Tuesday we'll have another fun 80s type flick. Then, until then, have a good one. Johnny saw RoboCop at 7. Oh my God, yeah. Your move, creep. That's the line that always comes in, so you know that that's RoboCop. Have a good night, everybody, and as always, stay extreme.